In the ancient halls of Eldridge College, whispers of terror floated like cobwebs in the corners. Warnings were posted everywhere about the Hatchet Man, a fiend who had brutally murdered a woman in Bloomington. The girls on campus were advised to walk in pairs and stay in well-lit areas after dark. Among those staying over Thanksgiving break were a sophomore named Alice and her roommate, Emily. With their families out of the country, they were left to fend for themselves. The days blurred together, each as monotonous as the last, and they grew weary of their self-imposed imprisonment. One evening, Emily suggested they break the monotony by dining at the local tavern. Alice, craving excitement, readily agreed. The night wore on, and the two friends lost track of time. It was nearly midnight when Alice, tipsy from too many drinks, decided to return to the dorm. Emily, engrossed in a flirtation with the bartender, barely noticed her leave. The streets were dark and silent as Alice staggered through the alleyways, her mind foggy from alcohol. She had forgotten all about the Hatchet Man until she found herself in a shadowy, deserted alley. Suddenly, the memory of the gruesome warnings surfaced, and sobriety hit her like a cold wind. The atmosphere shifted, growing thick with menace. The darkness seemed alive, watching her with hostile eyes. Her heart pounded as she quickened her pace. Was that breathing behind her? Footsteps echoing her own? Panic set in, and Alice broke into a run. She darted across the campus, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She flung herself into the dormitory, raced up 3 flights of stairs, and slammed into her room, locking the door behind her. Pressing her back against the door, she listened intently. Silence, no footsteps, no breathing, no hatchet-wielding maniac breaking down the door. She sighed with relief, feeling foolish for her fear. Alice stumbled to the bathroom to wash her face, casting nervous glances at the mirror. Everything seemed normal. The dormitory was eerily quiet, but she assured herself that all was well. Then she remembered Emily, still at the bar. Concerned for her safety, Alice called the tavern and asked the manager to arrange a taxi for her friend. The music blared in the background, and she wasn't sure if he understood her request, but she felt she had done her part. Exhausted, Alice curled up in bed, intending to wait for Emily. The combination of alcohol and fear quickly pulled her into a deep sleep. She awoke the next morning to sunlight streaming through the window, her head pounding from a hangover. Groaning, she rolled over and noticed Emily's bed was untouched. Panic surged through her as she got up, her heart racing. Maybe Emily had crashed in the lobby, too tired to climb the stairs. With trembling hands, Alice unlocked the door and yanked it open. A metallic scent of blood hit her like a wave. She froze, her eyes widening in horror. Blood was splattered across the walls and floor of the third-floor hallway. Her scream echoed through the empty dormitory as she took in the gruesome scene. At her feet lay Emily's body, partially decapitated and drenched in blood. Her throat had been slit from ear to ear, and her outstretched hand bore splintered nails, a testament to her desperate struggle against the wooden door. Alice's gaze followed the shadow cast across her roommate's body. There, embedded in the window frame near the staircase, was a blood-stained hatchet, its blade gleaming in the light of the rising sun. In the heart of California's Santa Lucia Range, where the mist-clad mountains meet the rugged coastline, a sense of ancient mystery pervades the air. The settlers called it Los Vigilantes Oscuros, the Dark Watchers. For generations, travelers and locals alike have whispered about the tall, shadowy figures that silently observe from the mountain ridges. always just beyond the reach of clear sight. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when Sarah Weston decided to hike the remote trails of Santa Lucia. She was an avid nature enthusiast, drawn to the untouched beauty and the promise of solitude. With a packed lunch and a camera slung over her shoulder, she set off, the sun casting long shadows across the path. As Sarah climbed higher, the forest grew denser, the air cooler. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of a hawk. She reached a ridge that offered a panoramic view of the valley below. The sight was breathtaking. The golden hues of the landscape bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. She sat down on a large rock to rest and take in the view. Her eyes drifted across the horizon when she noticed something unusual. On a distant ridge, shrouded in the hazy light, stood a tall, dark figure. Sarah squinted, trying to make out details, but the figure remained a silhouette, unmoving. A chill ran down her spine. She had heard the stories of the Dark Watchers, but had always dismissed them as local lore. As she watched, another figure appeared next to the first, then another, until there were several standing in a row. They seemed to be staring directly at her. The sun dipped lower, casting deeper shadows, and the figures seemed to blend into the growing darkness. Sarah felt an inexplicable sense of unease, as if she were intruding on something sacred. She shook off the feeling and decided to continue her hike. As she walked, the path grew narrower, the trees thicker. The light was fading fast, and she realized she needed to head back. Turning around, she retraced her steps, but the sense of being watched persisted. Every now and then she caught glimpses of the shadowy figures out of the corner of her eye, but when she turned to look directly, they vanished. Her pace quickened, her heart pounding. The forest, which had felt so serene earlier, now seemed oppressive, the trees closing in around her. The shadows lengthened, and the air grew colder. She could hear her own breath, ragged and anxious. The sense of being followed was overwhelming. Finally, she reached the clearing where she had first seen the figures. The ridge was now empty, but the sense of dread lingered. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself, when she heard a whisper. It was faint, like the rustle of leaves, but distinct. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakably ominous. Suddenly, the air grew still. The forest was deathly silent. Sarah turned, and there they were, the Dark Watchers, standing just at the edge of the clearing, closer than ever. Their forms were indistinct, almost blending into the shadows, but their presence was undeniable. They seemed to be observing her, silently judging. Fear gripped her. She backed away slowly, her eyes fixed on the figures. They did not move, but she felt their gaze follow her. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and she felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to flee. She turned and ran, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She didn't stop until she reached her car. Fumbling with the keys, she glanced back. The forest edge was empty, but she knew they were still watching. She drove away, the image of the dark figures etched in her mind. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw them, their shadowy forms looming over her. The whispering continued, haunting her dreams. She woke up in a cold sweat, the sense of dread ever present. The next day, she spoke to a local historian about her experience. The old man nodded solemnly.
"The Dark Watchers have been here long before us,"
he said.
"They see everything, but they do not like to be seen. Those who do see them will never forget it."
In a quiet village shrouded in perpetual fog, there lived an old woman named Eliza. Her house sat at the edge of a dense forest, its weathered timbers creaking with every gust of wind. Eliza had lived alone for years, her only company the memories of a long-lost family. The villagers whispered tales about her, calling her the Hermit of the Woods, a title that only deepened her isolation. One chilly autumn evening, as the wind howled outside and the shadows danced on the walls, Eliza sat in her dimly lit kitchen. The flickering light of a single candle cast eerie shapes across the room. The loneliness gnawed at her heart, and in a moment of weakness, she whispered to the darkness,
"Oh, how I wish I had some company."
The words had barely left her lips when a strange, hollow thud echoed from the chimney. Her heart skipped a beat as she turned her gaze towards the fireplace. Before she could react, 2 decayed feet tumbled down the chimney, landing with a sickening thump on the hearth. The flesh was rotted, exposing bone and sinew, and a putrid smell filled the room. Eliza's eyes widened in horror. Her breath caught in her throat. She watched, frozen in terror, as 2 legs followed, attaching themselves to the feet with a grotesque squelch. A torso, emaciated and covered in ragged clothes, slid down next, followed by arms that seemed to drag behind like dead weight. Finally, a head with hollow, sunken eyes and a gaping mouth landed with a hollow thud. The parts twitched and convulsed, inching closer together in a macabre dance. Eliza could not tear her eyes away as the limbs and body assembled themselves into a towering, gangling man. His skin hung in loose folds, and his eyes glowed with an unnatural light. He stood tall, his presence filling the small kitchen, and began to move. The man started to dance, a jerky, unsettling movement that made Eliza's skin crawl. He spun around the room faster and faster, his limbs flailing with a life of their own. The candle flickered wildly, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to come alive. Eliza's heart pounded in her chest, a drumbeat of pure terror. Suddenly, the man stopped his frenzied dance and turned to face her. His eyes bored into hers, and Eliza felt a chill run down her spine, rooting her to the spot. She could barely find her voice as she stammered,
What do you come for?"
The man tilted his head, a twisted grin spreading across his decayed face. His voice was a raspy whisper, like the rustling of dry leaves.
"What do I come for?"
he repeated, stepping closer with each word.
"I come for you."
With a speed that defied his gangly appearance, he lunged at her. Eliza screamed, a sound that echoed through the empty house and out into the night, swallowed by the howling wind. She tried to flee, but her legs refused to move, as if they were rooted to the floor. The man reached out with bony fingers, his touch as cold as the grave. Eliza's world went dark as his icy grip closed around her. The last thing she heard was his chilling laughter, a sound that would haunt the village for years to come. The next morning, the villagers found her house empty, the door hanging ajar. No trace of Eliza remained, but the air inside was thick with an unshakable sense of dread. From that day on, the old woman's house stood abandoned, a grim reminder of the night she wished for company and received something far more sinister. And on cold, foggy nights, some claim to hear faint echoes of her screams carried on the wind, a warning to be careful what you wish for in the dark. In the cobwebbed corners of Whitestone University, where old tomes whispered secrets and shadows danced beneath the Gothic spires, a young medical student named Victor was drawn to a new transfer student, Isabelle. She possessed an ethereal beauty, her long raven hair cascading like a midnight waterfall, her eyelashes so long they tangled in her curls when she leaned over her desk. Victor, often shunned due to the shadow of his father's madness, saw in Isabelle a beacon of hope and love. Victor, though naturally withdrawn, mustered the courage to speak to Isabelle, offering to tutor her in anatomy. Their study sessions blossomed into something more, and soon they were inseparable, bound by a passion that seemed to transcend the ordinary. For a time, Victor lived in a haze of happiness, but this bliss was shattered one day when he saw Isabelle laughing with another student. A handsome artist named Daniel. Jealousy, a dark and insidious force, gnawed at Victor's soul. How dare she share her laughter with another? Confronting her, he accused her of infidelity. Isabelle stared at him in shock, her words cutting deeper than any scalpel.
"You're mad,"
she said, echoing the words that haunted him since childhood. Their argument was fierce, but they reconciled over dinner, the storm passing as quickly as it had come. Yet the seed of doubt had been planted deep within Victor's heart. Friday night, a dance was held in the grand hall of Whitestone. Victor dressed in his finest and went to fetch Isabelle. As he grabbed his coat, a scalpel fell from his medical bag, landing with a soft thud on his desk. He shoved it back inside without a second thought and hurried to meet Isabelle. The evening was magical. They danced, laughed, and for a few hours Victor's fears were forgotten. As midnight approached, they left the party and walked back to Victor's dorm, the moon casting long shadows on the cobblestone paths. In the entryway, Isabelle paused to ask a question of a fellow student, a red-haired poet who lived in her building. A surge of jealousy overwhelmed Victor once more. When they reached his room, he could no longer contain his rage.
"You flirt with every man you meet,"
he shouted. Isabelle's face hardened.
"You are stark raving mad,"
she retorted. Blinded by fury, Victor reached for the scalpel. When his vision cleared, Isabelle lay at his feet, her throat a crimson smile. The room was painted in blood, her raven hair fanned out in a dark halo. Desperation and madness overtook him. He had to hide the evidence, but first, an act of twisted love. Kneeling, he carefully cut off her face, wrapping it in plastic and placing it in his desk drawer. The next morning, Victor told his roommate, Edward, that Isabelle had left in a fit of anger. Edward, absorbed in his own studies, accepted the story without question. He didn't notice how Victor obsessively peered into his desk drawer. Victor managed to attend his morning class, but upon returning, he found Edward looking pale, leaning out the window.
"I think I'm coming down with something. I'll go to the pharmacy,"
Edward mumbled.
"Want me to check?"
Victor asked, reaching for his bag. Edward turned white.
No need."
He stammered, fleeing the room. Downstairs, Edward frantically dialed the police. When they arrived with a warrant, Victor's world collapsed. They dragged him from his chair as a grim-faced officer opened the desk drawer. The sight within made him recoil, swearing violently before vomiting. Victor was taken to an asylum placed next to his father, who raged against his own confinement. Each day, as his father's fists pounded against the padded walls, Victor stared out the barred window, seeing Isabelle's face in the swaying branches of an old tree, the leaves whispering secrets of guilt and madness. Once upon a time, nestled deep within an ancient forest, there stood an abandoned house. Time had weathered its wooden frame, and nature had begun reclaiming it, vines curling around its beams like fingers of a ghostly hand. The house was said to contain the remains of a hermit, enshrined in a coffin in the loft, an old custom among the Iroquois people. Though the tradition had faded, the hermit's last wish had been honored. When her husband decided they would stay in the house for the winter, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold.
There is good hunting here,
he had declared, and so they moved in, bringing their few belongings. She avoided the loft where the hermit's body lay, its presence a silent, unsettling guest. Her husband, eager to hunt, left each day at dawn, leaving her alone with their young daughter. To avoid the house, she wandered the forest, gathering roots and berries, her daughter nestled in a sling on her back. Each evening she returned to prepare the meal, while her husband, weary from the hunt, rested in the loft. One evening, as the scent of roasting meat filled the air, she heard a muffled cry followed by the sickening crunch of breaking bones. Her heart pounded as she stared upward. Blood began to drip from the rafters, staining the floor below. Moving with the stealth of a deer, she crept to a corner where she could see into the loft. A skeletal figure, its eye sockets glowing a malevolent red, was feasting on her husband. Its bony fingers tore flesh from bone, its teeth stained with blood. Her daughter stirred at her back, sensing her mother's fear. She knew they had to escape.
I'm going to fetch water for the broth,
She called, forcing calm into her voice. Grabbing a pail, she walked toward the stream, her steps deliberate and unhurried. Once out of sight, she broke into a run, her heart hammering in her chest. A terrible howl erupted from the house as the creature realized its prey was escaping. The forest closed around her as she ran, the creature's howls growing louder. Her daughter wailed in fright, but she pushed on, tears blurring her vision. The skeletal fiend was gaining on them, its breath hot on her neck. In a final act of desperation, she let out the Iroquois distress cry, her voice echoing through the trees. To her relief, the call was answered by warriors from the village. She could hear the creature closing in, its bony fingers outstretched, just as she broke through the tree line and collapsed at the village edge. The warriors, torches in hand, confronted the skeletal horror. They swung their torches wide, driving the creature back. It retreated, hissing and howling, towards the old hermit's house. The warriors set the cabin ablaze, flames licking up the walls, engulfing it in a fiery inferno. From the loft came a terrible scream as the vampire hermit, in the form of a rabbit, fled into the woods, never to be seen again.